In today's modern go-go world, if you're an adult action figure collector, you have more choices than ever, not just with brands, but even within a brand. How many different styles and scales and versions of the same character you want to buy are really more plentiful than they've ever been. And one has to question, what motivates us as adult collectors to pick the figures we choose to collect? Well, a lot of it comes from our childhood and sort of filling in that gap of things we couldn't have. So, for example, I bought this Merman figure because, well, I never owned the original Merman figure in 1982. My best friend Sean had him. But yeah, I grew up Merman-less. My first Merman, I think, was the 2000X figure. And of course, I got the Classics one. And then, obviously, there was also the added issue with Merman that the new one in Origins sort of kind of looks like the cross-cell that we were shown on the back that we never got. So the new one is making up for a toy I could never get as a child. Another good example is the X-Men X-Force figures from Toy Biz. I wasn't able to get these as a child because this was out at a time when I was kind of trying to get out of toys and into adult stuff because I was in junior high now, and it's why I'm so fanatic about collecting X-Men and Marvel Legends, and especially X-Force. All right, so that's obviously one big reason we collect, is to make up for things we couldn't have as a child. But I want to talk about another issue which doesn't really get brought up that much, and that's the power of action figures appearing on TV. And I don't mean in commercials, of course, I mean in the actual content. In order to understand this, we have to do a little bit of toy history. So let's jump in. So obviously, cartoons, when they started in the 20s and 30s, were meant to be entertainment for people of all ages. Obviously, they very much appealed to children, and they were skewed young, but it was something new. By the time children's programming matured in the 50s and 60s, we started getting programming that was directly educational, at least in concept. Romper Room was one of the, proto versions of this, followed by things like Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers, all the way up to the Teletubbies and Barney from today. Well, the interesting thing about Romper Room is it was one of the first children's shows, and granted it was an educational show, that had its own merchandise. And this was merchandise not just, example, with the Romper Room name on it, like you could go buy a t-shirt or something. We're talking about actual things that appeared in the show that kids could buy as toys. Not as prop replicas, but as interactive items that got used on the show to feel like you were more of a part of the environment and part of the fantasy. And this became an issue because children have a hard time differentiating entertainment and toys, commercials. They all tend to blend. The Hot Wheels TV show from the 1970s was one that wound up on the chopping block over this because there was a lot of concern that the cartoon show was just advertising toys to children.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
Well, by the time the 1980s rolled around, Ronald Reagan became president, and one of the things he did was he deregulated the FCC, and specifically the laws that prevented children's programming from having animated shows that directly promoted product. So if you grew up in the 80s, you probably know just what I mean. Lots and lots of shows, specifically between 1981 and 1989, were designed to sell toys. They were also designed to be entertaining, but they were directly meant to be sort of your toys coming alive and getting to actually watch your toys talk and battle and act out adventures and storylines. And it was a big thrill. And getting to own the toys that you saw coming alive on weekday afternoons was part of the magic of growing up in the 80s and this very special time when there was so much awesome content. Now, parents saw this and there was frustration at the idea that these shows were sort of just being created simply to sell merchandise. But the irony of this is that these shows and these properties that were created during this window of time in the 80s when the FCC was deregulated created some of the most memorable properties. And today, toy companies are basing entire lines on the nostalgia of playing with these toys in the 80s and hoping you'll want to pass that joy onto a new generation. So whereas they were trying to sort of push back on this in the 80s, now it's getting to see your toys come alive, well, it's something we don't get as much. I mean, I'm not talking about something like Toy Story here, where you're actually watching the characters live. It was much more where you got a peek into the world. But one of the limitations about getting to, say, a peek into your characters or your toys' lives on screen was that most of the shows tended to have a very, firm, small cast because it's expensive to create new animation. And when characters that weren't part of the main cast showed up as, call it a cameo or a guest appearance on an episode, that was an episode to celebrate. That was an amazing moment because you're used to seeing certain characters over and over again. But when the secondary or tertiary characters would show up as guest stars, it was this feeling of like, wow, that's my toy on screen. I mean, I'm used to seeing He-Man and Skeletor and Optimus Prime and Megatron, etc., etc. But when a guest star or even a vehicle showed up that wasn't a regular vehicle, if you had that toy, seeing that toy on screen was one of the most special things. You got used to seeing the regular characters. You knew who the cast was. You expected that when you tuned in at 3 o'clock or 4:30. Well, you'd be pleasantly surprised when a guest star would show up, and if you owned the toy of that guest star, there was definitely a sort of a transaction where the way you see yourselves as an avatar of that toy, because if you control that toy, if you're controlling it, to a child, the toy is very much them. It's taking the place of them in the storyline and putting this toy in the show. If you own the toy, well, not every child is going to be able to be on TV. I mean, obviously, there's child TV stars out there, but, children dream of being TV stars, and the idea of, being able to star in your own show or your own movie is very aspirational. But it's not something most children are going to ever experience. And the idea of getting an action figure made of you, unless you're a Hollywood star or you happen to work for a toy company for several decades, the chance of that is pretty slim. So the next best thing for a child is to see a toy that they actually own on a show. I mean, obviously now as adult collectors, there's services where you can have yourself made as a toy, and they can make custom action figures and do what's called a portrait sculpt of you and plop it onto a generic body. There's several companies that offer this. You should have no problem finding them on Google. Target even offered this as an in-store promotion about 10 years ago, but it didn't do too well, or we'd still see it around. So that's sort of one way, obviously, of getting an action figure of yourself. But when you can't have that, there was the sort of transposition of yourself as your toy. And if a toy you own, like Jitsu here, appeared on the show, granted he was called Chopper on the show, but we all knew it was Jitsu. He was only on one episode. But if you saw that episode and if you owned this particular action figure, in a way it was like you were on the show because that toy was in your toy box. You owned it. And so that meant that you could have the battles. You could battle He-Man or G.I. Joe or, the Autobots or the Care Bears. I mean, the Thundercats, there's no N. I know I'm using a lot of He-Man images of toys, but it works for any brand. It was as if this episode was custom designed for the child. Seeing a toy they owned, seeing a toy you owned on the show was one of the coolest moments of childhood, and no one really ever talks about this. What it was like, this surprise and delight feeling of seeing something you own, a toy that you could imagine yourself as in your playroom, in your play, and actually see that come alive. And it brings up the question of why do we like what we like? Why are we attracted to certain characters as adult collectors? And throwing this out there because I believe that the connection is to the figures you actually own. So as an example, I owned that Genghis frog. And when the character showed up on Ninja Turtles, it was really cool to see a toy I owned. I'm much more likely to be interested in this 2-pack that NECA has out now featuring the same character versus another 2-pack that might have characters that I never had as a kid. So essentially, if you owned the figure and the figure showed up on the TV show, that drives collectability because you experience that feeling of seeing your toy come alive. And in essence, you are that toy, and you're on the show with your heroes. Versus something like Ground Chuck here, while I owned a lot of Ninja Turtles, he came out late in the line when I was kind of getting away from toys temporarily until they pulled me back in with those darn Power of the Force 2 figures. But yeah, I never owned Ground Chuck, and while I know him from the video game, not as interested in this pack because I never had the figure and never saw him on the show. So, what is a toy company to do with this type of information? And it's not something that I see too many toy companies looking into. But my theory, and that I sort of propose out there to internet world, is that by focusing on characters that appeared in the content, as opposed to characters that were just toys, you get a double hit. Obviously, people are fans of the toys they had as a child. You're very much attached to childhood product, childhood memories, because, well, it's what made you feel comfortable. It made you feel wholesome, before you had mortgages and adulting, if you will, to deal with. Watching those characters come alive on television and seeing your toys come alive on television was such a magical thing. And while you can't always get what you want, when that would come together, toy, appearance on the show, and now modern adult version, it's this like quadruple win. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. What toys did you love seeing come alive when you were a child? Wasn't it such a joy when your toy would walk onto the screen animated? What was that like? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Please do share this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.